Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the World Green Building Council's event. We will get started in a couple of minutes. Thank you for joining us. Okay, let's get started. We have got a lot to get through. Welcome, everyone, to the World Green Building Council's Circular City Week New York session, where we will be exploring the circular economy in the built environment. Through this session, we will facilitate a conversation with subject experts from around the world to present the opportunities and challenges of circularity within the built environment, looking at both our buildings and our infrastructure and exploring whether they present this great untapped opportunity for implementing a circular economy and regenerating our natural environment. My name is Katrina Brady. I'm Director of Strategy and Development at the World Green Building Council and speaking to you this afternoon from London in the United Kingdom.
And I'm Rhiannon Jacobson, the Circularity Accelerator Program Officer at the World Green Building Council, and I'm joining you all from Barcelona, Spain. We've got a lovely session lined up today and an engaging discussion later on. We're going to start with a few opening remarks from myself and Katrina, and then dive into our panel discussion with our key subject experts. And our goal really today is that each of you are going to walk away with some new insights into the market trends and innovative solutions from around the world, and a clearer understanding of actions and work streams that will increase our collective potential for scaling impact within this space. So great stuff. There's going to be opportunity for us to engage today, so please do feel free to add any questions along the way into the chat box for our speakers. We'll be keeping an eye on that. And then also just to let you know, I'll also be dropping a few questions for yourself. So we'd love to hear your thoughts as well. Katrina?
Thank you, Adrian. So yes, we're really looking forward to hearing from you. We've learned in the last 2 years, haven't we, how to create interactive sessions. So looking forward to a virtual discussion. I will begin with a few words, if I may, on the World Green Building Council Global Network. So the World Green Building Council, or WorldGBC Global Network, catalyses the uptake of sustainable buildings for everyone, everywhere. Our global network is comprised of the green building councils in 70 countries around the world, and collectively we represent a combined membership of 36,000 organisations looking to accelerate action to deliver on the ambition of the Paris Agreement and the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And we do this by accelerating critical systems transitions that need to take place across all our sectors to achieve a sustainable built environment. The strategy of the World Green Building Council is focused around 3 thematic impact areas. And our conversation today, given its Circularity City Week, will naturally focus on resources and circularity. where we have specific targets for the circular economy and resource use aligned to the targets of the Sustainable Development Goals. But I'm very sure with the panel of experts we're about to hear from that our conversation will certainly verge into the topics of health and social value, climate action, climate change mitigation, adaptation and resilience. So our aspirational or our North Star goal for the network, which we developed through a global consultation in 2020, is that we are striving to create a built environment that facilitates the regeneration of resources in natural systems whilst providing socio-economic benefits through a circular economy. And if you're interested in the strategy that underpins this work, you can read more details behind this in WorldGBC's publication, Sustainable Buildings for Everyone Everywhere, via the WorldGBC website.
Great. So let's look into the context and consider the challenges that we face today. But let's view that, noting that the built environment also presents a massive opportunity. But let's start with the problem statement. The harsh reality is that between COP21 in Paris and COP26 in Glasgow, the global economy consumed 70% more than what the Earth could safely replenish. Our sector is utilizing around 40% of the global resources, over 1/3 of materials used worldwide are for buildings, and less than 9% of that is less than 9% of global materials consumed are then kept in productive cycles of use. Toxic chemicals are everywhere, found both in our water supply and in some of the most remote corners of the Earth. And this has damaging effects on human health and our ecosystems. Putting it into our developmental context, we aspire for all 8 billion people on planet Earth to have equitable access to resources and to live in a fair and sustainably developed world. But we simply do not have enough finite resources to carry on with the current linear take, make, waste consumption model. A reductive model will not work. People using less is important, but will not solve the problem. A transition to a circular approach is the only solution. This is the problem we're tackling with our global network of green building councils and our coalition of partners. So now it's time for us to ask the question, what is the circular economy and how do we apply its principles to the built environment? Katrina.
Thank you, Adrian. That is indeed the question. And luckily we have 5 subject experts on hand waiting to dive into it with us. But I'll kick off with just a few words of background and theory, building on what Adrian's just explained. Now, I think probably most of us know that today the vast majority of resources that we use across all industries, so for buildings, yes, but agriculture, textiles, transport, so many sectors are being used in a linear fashion, what we refer to as take, make, waste, as Adrian just said. And this model, the basis of this linear economy, is a model in which raw materials are collected, transformed into products, which then have a very brief lifespan of usefulness, and then thrown away. And in this system, we consider value to be created by producing and selling as many products as possible. And that would be fantastic if we had an endless and infinite amount of raw materials and energy and labor. But the problem is that that situation is simply not the case. In the middle of this graphic, we see the recycling economy, which is, as I'm sure we're all familiar with the concept, all about taking materials back, repurposing them and producing another product as new. I think one of the biggest misconceptions within the sustainability industry that many of us are tackling is that recycling is really considered one of the stalwart pieces of sustainability, but that really is far from the case because the recycling economy has embedded emissions because of the process of repurposing these materials. Whilst this is better than the linear take, make, waste system, the optimal solution for true sustainability is for us to be keeping products and materials in use for as long as possible in their current or a deconstructed or simplified state without an energy-intensive repurposing or transportation stage between each use. So that takes me to what we are championing, the principles of a circular economy. And these are principles which are shared across all different sectors. So I'm sure many of our participants joining us today live or on the recording are hearing this as well across different sector events in Circularity City Week. So these principles, thinking about them from a building and construction perspective, would include, firstly, designing out waste and pollution. So reducing the creation of waste, making sure our buildings and assets are net zero operationally and across the whole life cycle, removing toxins to ensure they're healthy indoor environments for people, and that the materials can be circulated in the future. Secondly, keeping materials in use. This is key. The circular economy is not about simply recycling, as we mentioned. Yes, it's great if we can have materials that can be recycled, but ideally we want a built environment that can be dismantled or adapted or reused if we don't need it in a number of years' time and turned into something else. And finally, regeneration. Circular economy is ultimately all about improving the environment and enhancing our ecosystem services and removing toxins from buildings and our natural systems, bringing back biodiversity into cities, restoring nature. And we'll hear a lot more about these principles in a few short moments. Now, it's extremely exciting for me today to be able to announce for the first time that the World Green Building Council's Circular Built Environment Accelerator global programme will officially launch on the 16th of May. This is the programme that we have been working on for close to 2 years now, and the programme will operate as a central forum for knowledge sharing and facilitation amongst our Green Building Council network, including our programme partners and the wider industry. As this programme kicks off and then grows, it will become a hub of resources around practical guidelines, market insights, principles for design, case studies, advocacy information, thought leaderships, reports, and much more. So we hope that you will all be able to join us on this journey as we kick off this exciting new global initiative. Anyway, let's progress back with the session for today and proceed now to the next part of our event, which is an expert panel discussion with 5 international subject experts, where we're going to unpick the biggest circularity challenges and why the sector needs to embrace circularity. So let me begin by introducing our panel. Going left to right, we have Phil Kelly with us, who is Director and Head of Sustainability for Buildings UK at Ramble. Phil has built a team across the UK to assist clients in meeting the complex sustainability challenges of today, whilst also being resilient to future legislative and market changes. Across the 14 years of his career, he has built extensive experience in technical analysis, environmental assessments, and strategic consulting. Welcome, Phil. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Next, we have Sonny Vismer, who is the Communication and Stakeholder Engagement Manager at Brightworks. At Brightworks, Sonny works with both clients and the greater sustainability community to continue to grow positive global impact. In the past, Sonny led the International Living Future Institute's extensive Living Future network, Living Future accredited ambassadors, collaboratives, partners, and affiliates in more than 70 nations. So we'll look forward to her international insights. Good morning, Sonny.
Good morning, thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Chris Trott, who is Partner and Head of Sustainability at Foster & Partners. Chris is an experienced head with a demonstrated history of working in the architecture and planning industry. He is skilled in sustainable development, design management, feasibility studies, energy efficiency and environmental awareness, a strong professional with a Master of Science, MS focused in building services, engineering from the University of Glasgow. Thanks for joining us, Chris.
Hello, nice to be with you.
Nice to have you, thank you. Next, we have Rhiannon Jacobson, who's the Managing Director of US Market Transformation and Development at the US Green Building Council. Rhiannon is a senior leader with 20 years of nonprofit and greater sustainability industry experience, who has delivered more than $100 million in revenue and developed programs engaging hundreds of thousands of constituents and stakeholders. She's a builder and motivator of teams that generate traditional and philanthropic revenue, develop award-winning programs, and engage stakeholders in the nonprofit, private, and public market sectors. Good morning, Rhiannon.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us. And last but certainly not least, we have David Simons, who is the UK Director of Sustainability for WSP. David is the global leader of WSP's Future Ready Innovation Programme and the leader of WSP's corporate sustainability practice, who are providing clear business advice on ESG, TCFD, and strategies grounded in engineering, business consultancy, and science. David is a regular media commentator on environmental issues, amongst many other accolades. Welcome, David.
Thanks, Katrina. Hello, everybody.
Hello, hello. So let's progress with our session now without any slides so that we can see each other. And I will kick off with some questions for you all. First, let's have an opening remark from each of you so we can hear each of your voices before we dive into the more technical content. So this is a Circular City New York event. Why does this audience need to engage with the circular economy movement? Phil, let's start with you, please.
Hi there. Well, we all know that in the context of buildings and infrastructure, doing no net harm is simply not going to be enough to meet our climate goals. There's a lot of both societal and economic value that can be generated, as well as captured through circularity, not just the environmental benefits.
Thank you. Nicely succinct. Sonny, let's come to you next.
Thank you. Yes, and I think there is a fantastic opening question in the chat as well that I think is really, really timely. And to the question, which was about New York specifically and some of the legislation in the United States that does require us to put things in landfills at this time. I think building relationships, and I'll talk more about this as we go on, but building relationships is really going to be key to shifting that. There's really no shortcut. And the city of New York is a rather famous place, and I think will continue to be for bringing people together in close quarters to really connect and develop new ways and innovative ways of doing things. And I think that will have the largest influence both on political change and also opportunities to provide circular economies both in New York and elsewhere in the future.
Thank you, Sonny, and thanks for bringing the New York focus back and also reminding our participants today that you can share your questions in the chat box for our speakers. So please do let us know if there's anything you'd like to ask them. Chris, let's come to you next.
Thank you, Katrina. Well, even with today's population, we are consuming 70% more resources than can be sustainably produced on Earth. And we think about 50% of those are consumed in the built environment. And that contributes to around about 15% of global greenhouse gas emissions if you look at construction and demolition of buildings. So, and we think there's a very direct link between greenhouse gas emissions and resource consumption. So it's absolutely critical that we get resource consumption down to sustainable levels.
Thank you. This is beautifully said. Rhiannon, let's come to you next.
Right. This is a tough one to go after everyone else, and some great answers. I want to, again, just thank you for having me here today. But so when we think about this at USGBC, our really kind of the secret to the work that we've done has really been around collaboration and making sure that we engage all audiences. So when you think about a market as large as New York City, that is really taking leadership stances and approaches to things, of course, this audience needs to be engaged, because really, the circular economy is a new way to look at old problems. These old problems exist because we haven't figured out how to solve them yet. And that is going to really require enormous number of stakeholders in just that continued collaboration. And really, the built environment must engage on this. And it is going to take a lot of different minds and perspectives to get us there.
Thank you. A great soundbite there with the new solution to old problems. That's one for Twitter, I think. Thanks, Rhiannon. David, let's come to you next.
Yeah, great. And yeah, fifth up, Rhiannon, rather than fourth up. So I really am last on this one as well. So look, let me just, as well as some great answers so far, I will just say the circular economy is good for the environment and it's good for business. And let me give you two examples for that. One, tenants and occupiers, WSP included, our time horizons are becoming much shorter. We are wanting flexible, adaptable, permanently temporary buildings that can change to our needs, which we don't necessarily know what they are to the future. So being able to design buildings that can be chopped and changed around super easily is great business. And then the second thing, if I just bring a European context to New York, as part of cities and their climate emergency strategies, we are seeing the very fast emergence now of planning policies that limit the traditional approach to building of bashing something down before and building new, to say that you have to adapt what is there now. And that has become an enormously fast emerging theme. We only see that going one way. And so designing buildings which are circular meaning they are adaptable, they have a long life, they can be easily reused. That is absolutely the future of the built environment.
Thank you so much. And I'm very impressed. We managed to get 5 different answers as opening remarks. That bodes very well. Thank you to our speakers. And let's dive in a little more to some of the topics that you brought up in those opening remarks. I want to dive a little bit more into this question of why circularity matters so greatly for the built environment. But I want to try and frame this as well within these broader topics of sustainability that I mentioned in the strategy, you guys have talked about as well. So Phil, let's come to you first. Why does circularity matter so greatly for the built environment? But could you also maybe think a little bit about from a climate action and social perspective as well?
Well, it's already been said today, and simply put, we know we don't have unlimited resources. We know that's very clear. So we need to reduce what we use now and retain what we already have. And we need to do that both now and continue doing that in the future. There's so many things we can do now to facilitate that still being the case as we progress. But I think from a societal and wider perspective as well, we've just shown through recent events how vulnerable resource availability is to both geopolitical as well as climate change. So we really need to make our built environment resilient to this risk as we go forward. There's an environmental benefit as well as many others at the same time. I think rather than make marginal gains through incremental efficiency improvements and things like that, we need to explore and adopt completely different business models to really change both at scale and to the extent that we need to in order to meet the 1.5 degree warming world.
Thanks, Phil. And I think your point about really energy resilience and geopolitics will speak to a lot of people right now. Thank you. Sonny, do you want to come in on that?
Yes, absolutely. I was hoping you would ask. I really, this is a really interesting question that I think is really important to address in the full breadth of the amount of time it will take to engage with the people necessary to make that shift. And I'll tell you why. So if we really want to tackle, and that was a fantastic opening statement by you, Adrian, all of those issues that you presented, what we all need to do is really, as much as possible, refuse new things, refuse new buildings, refuse new office furniture, refuse new everything. And the reason for that is because the sort of elephant in the room, if you will, for carbon emissions that I think the SEC here in the US and the ISSB and those types of bodies are only starting to look at internationally is our scope 3 emissions, or the embodied emissions of the things that we own and the things that we use and the buildings that we use. And those are going to continue to grow. And the only way for us to reduce that is, of course, to stop producing new things and really try to create relationships with the people that we think might have things that we'll need to use in the future. And every time we do create a new thing, having a plan for where that thing will go when we're done using it. And the amount of time and energy spent investing in those relationships is huge. And right now it's no one's responsibility. And I think that taking that personal responsibility and finding ways to help our clients and everyone in their supply chain take that responsibility as a design problem is certainly something that I'm very keen to keep working on, and I think will be the crux of answering that question.
Thank you, Sonny. And I think people appreciate the words of practical advice that you've given us there, because these are quite difficult, intangible concepts. So that's something we'll definitely look back to. I'm going to start adapting the questions a bit to bring in questions we're getting from the audience. And Chris and Rhiannon, I wanted to ask you to delve a little bit into what circular outcomes look like in the built environment. Chris, maybe you can give us a bit of a design perspective, possibly talk about case studies. Rhiannon, perhaps you might talk about some of the work USGBC is doing, but I'd love to just bring in this question we've had from Mary, saying our organisation is a member of the Queen's NYC Solid Waste Advisory Board with particular concerns about construction and demolition debris export to landfills. What advice can we offer to the world and to New York that will reduce the health and environmental impacts of this 68% of material that is landfilled in the US? And how is Europe dealing with this? And we do have a few European speakers there. So Chris, maybe I'll come to you first, if that's okay. What are the key principles of circularity that you're implementing in projects that could be useful for tackling these kind of issues that we're hearing from the audience today?
Okay, thanks for the question, Katrina. Yeah, well, just responding to that, I think the first point to be made before we even kind of get into the issue of reuse of products is to retain in use existing buildings as far as possible, and you know, to find some way of actually adapting them and working with them, because one of the things that we found, certainly from an emissions perspective, is it's almost impossible to knock down a building and to put back a building around about the same size, a brand new building, and have a better whole life cycle carbon outcome. The new building cannot be good enough because of all of the embodied carbon and all of the activity that's gone into it. So the first thing absolutely is to love existing buildings and to keep them in use as long as possible. And of course, what that does lead us to is where you need new buildings, or where new buildings can't be kept in use, you have a couple of different options. The first thing you've got to do is design them so they can be taken apart and reused easily in the future. So there needs to be a plan before you start a new building, or even before you start a refurbishment, to allow for its second, third and fourth life. So I think those are the kind of the high level things, and we've just been completely amazed at the difference between best-in-class new build versus best-in-class refurbishment. And best-in-class refurbishment is almost always going to win.
Thank you, Chris. And that reminds me of that statement that we hear. I feel like we need to get it on a t-shirt, that the most sustainable building is the existing building. Rhiannon, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, that was absolutely the same point that I was going to make, because so much of what we do in the built environment is actually very unsustainable. So when we look at this, and we'll talk a little bit about what USGBC and LEED are doing now, but the kind of biggest point that I want to stress, so when we talk about now, we are in a process of really re-envisioning and setting a new future kind of scape and direction for the LEED rating system to ensure, and I think we can all agree the bar needs to be much higher. And certainly a lot of the concepts that we're talking about today are going to be part of that work that's happening. But so overall, when we think, kind of quick narrative on this, what does it mean for the built environment? We're in a mostly linear economy. We take, we make, we dispose. That's what happens to buildings today. It is certainly contributing to things like the, landfill disaster. We make them mostly out of virgin materials. They're not super durable. And then when we're done with the building, we tear it down and we recycle 30 to 50% of those materials, and then we build something new. So we just start the entire process all over again. So when we look at it, really on the contrary, when we think about, what does a circular environment look like, it's very different. There are less virgin materials. Most of what would make up buildings is coming from reuse, salvage, bio-based or recycled materials. And our buildings should last longer. They are used more intensely, more people, more services, and they need to be designed, so similar to what Chris was saying, to be renovated and upgraded rather than demolished. So again, I think that, big focus on duration versus, kind of some of the shiny objects that oftentimes get, that focus. And so when we think about, where we're at now, our LEED version 4.1 rating system addresses many of the circular economy interventions. So we're promoting things like building reuse. We're designing spaces for flexibility. And certainly, and I'll just go back, designing spaces for flexibility has never been more obvious and needed in a post-pandemic world, when we're looking at, really a need to not just almost in a sense retrofit on the fly, because people's uses have become different for these spaces. We're also promoting reuse, salvage, and recycling, of course. We've got points for all of these strategies, and certainly as an organization, we know that by incentivizing people through things like points with LEED, we're able to make some of those changes and really, again, create a lot of the outcomes that we're looking for.
Thank you, Rhiannon. And David, I'll come to you in just a second to get your thoughts, but I would just love to pick up a bit more on what Rhiannon's just said there about highlighting the fact that flexible buildings today are becoming essential as we all redefine the new working world. And what I think this is taking me towards in my thinking is about these wider opportunities that the circular economy is presenting, because I don't think any of us listening today or on the recording are going to be arguing with the fact that circular buildings are good for the planet. But maybe you can also share a few thoughts on these broader co-benefits of circularity for people and planet as well.
Sure, and yeah, just before I'll come to that, I just wanted to very quickly just give a little build on to the question that Mary had made. So just again, you asked from a European perspective. It's pretty topical, because most of the construction and demolition waste that comes in the UK is actually reused. And in February this year, the Mineral Products Association, I think it was, came out with a report that said we've reached peak recycling for this waste. I could put the report in the chat, but I think the point that is just worth noting is, I would completely agree with Chris that the challenge with that sort of bald statement about recycling is you are not recycling a structural beam for a structural beam. You're bashing it up, you're crushing it, and you're using it in aggregates. You are not using a beautiful glazing panel for a beautiful glazing panel. You're using it for something much lower down. So I think just a couple of points is absolutely look to Europe to say, look at total recycling rates. Europe does that pretty well, but it is absolutely not the final version in terms of this is circular economy. It is like level 1, rather than it being sort of, yeah, we have all of the answers on this side of the Atlantic. Now, Kat, to your point, I mean, the opportunities that circularity brings for people and planet is, I mean, it just fundamentally it makes places that work for us as people and works for business and is lower cost and is it just suits how we might live into the future. So I mean, if we just think about how we all live, think about the sort of family lives that we're going through. You know, you maybe sort of you start off in a house as a young person, as a professional, you then get a family, you then come into older age, and you know, just in terms of a better, flexible, more sort of circular building, the nirvana for that are ones which easily adapt to that, and we are seeing that. So you know, Geraghty Taylor's live-in homes have just been built in Croydon. They are examples that have been designed to as sort of 6-bedroom homes, but they can be divided up according to different house stages as well. Ladywell in Lewisham took 3 months to build, 20% lower build cost. And again, just some practical examples of where some of those circular principles have been put into practice. And if you then come to a commercial perspective as well, if you go to IKEA's Malmo head office, I mean, I suppose you probably would expect IKEA to be pretty on point on this as well. But there is a classic example of an office building that is designed to be permanently temporary, and all of the structures within it can be moved around inside as more meeting rooms are needed, as less meeting rooms are needed, no waste at all. And if you then come down to the lowest level, some years ago, we were doing some work with the world's biggest retailer on their refrige systems, and just changing an aisle from clothing to chilled. That used to be a sort of either a full week's work, or it was thrashed out in a weekend with fairly questionable build quality. Just being able to move that to plug and play, where you can just change an aisle over, very, very quickly, just by using plug and play modular components, lower waste, lower cost, much more efficient for the retailer, and even better, it reduced the amount of chilling gases that were lost as well. So it really does work well, and the arguments for generally are so much stronger than the arguments against, just so long as, probably being a bit contrarian, we're probably talking a commercial language rather than just the sort of the phrase circularity that sometimes can get a little bit academic.
David, thank you. There was so much in there, and I think we've got an inspired audience, because I'm seeing questions popping up left, right and centre asking us for examples of how we do this. So I'm going to pull in Christine's question, who's asking, what suggestions do you have for adapting current existing buildings? For example, how would you approach adapting an existing building to be more water resilient from intense precipitation? And let's also tie that into Simone's question, who is asking for some of the strategies of design for new or refurbishment that help make the building transferable and adaptable and designed for disassembly, as we've heard. Sonny, I can see you nodding away. Would you like to take this one?
I would love to, and this is a question I get often from our clients as well. And I really just want to emphasize that the answer to this question is going to entirely depend on you and your community, and specifically what the needs in this place are. And I want to unpack that a little bit, because I think a lot of folks, and there was another excellent question of how do we avoid, like, what was it, the Spider-Man meme of everyone pointing at each other of whose responsibility is it to do this? And I love that example, because you're never going to avoid that. There's always going to be that moment of tension of who's going to take responsibility for this, where someone is going to need to, in order for us to move through, to Rhiannon's excellent point earlier, through to find a solution to this very old problem. And I think one of the things that folks often reference, as they should, in conversations about circularity from the academic side, is examples of the brilliance of communities that have been living in harmony with their natural world in different ways than I would say many of us on the call here currently are, though I can't speak and I don't know everyone's personal circumstances. And I think in the past, when we all lived more locally before the age of the internet and all these other things, we had to make do, and we had to form relationships with each other in order to share information and share physical objects in ways that we don't have to do anymore. In some ways, it's more convenient for us not to. But that messy, difficult work of getting to know our neighbors, getting to know our communities, getting to know where those needs are, that's really where the magic of circularity starts to happen. And this is something where we're working very closely with a number of our clients in engaging with their suppliers to help their suppliers make these connections. And there's no fast way to do this. It's a lot of time. It's a lot of building trust. It's a lot of working with individuals in individual circumstances, understanding their profit and loss, understanding the types of issues they care about and the causes they're connected to. And that's going to be building by building, product by product, in every instance. There's no one size fits all, especially if you want to talk about rainwater recycling. What are the water patterns? What's your ecosystem look like? What does the specific site have in terms of water opportunities and needs for the local people and the local plants, animals, etc. So there's really a lot to unpack, but we have to go site by site for me to actually, I think, answer that question in a robust way.
I think that's a really important thing for us to pull out here, Sonny, that we can share strategies and principles, but the circular economy requires on the interdependency of infrastructure and geography that's totally different for all of us around the world. But Chris, I don't know if there are any kind of high-level architectural or design principles that you would share to answer these questions that we're getting about strategies for newer retrofitted buildings?
Yeah, sure. So I think one of the things that's clearly the case is that generous buildings, which are designed for flexibility, and some, I mean, in the UK, a lot of our old Victorian buildings, if they're still around, then that's a real kind of signal for the circular economy, because they may already have had 3 or 4 uses. They may have been a factory, they may have been an office, they may have been a residential development by now. So having kind of quite generous spaces is really worth thinking about, because it means that you can change use without demolishing the building. So I think that's kind of one of the things that I would certainly think about. The other thing is it's not unreasonable to take another couple of approaches. We said earlier that this is about the resource intensity per person. So actually what you really want to do is you want to try and convince clients to really sweat the asset. In other words, get as much use out of the building and put as many people in the building as is sensibly possible. So, with the kind of changes in working patterns that we've seen, with a lot more work from home and other such things these days, I mean, people can probably, organizations can probably move to a paradigm where they've got far more workers in far less stuff. And that's a pretty good way of approaching it, because at the end of the day, there is only so much resource available for everybody. So I think actually making the buildings work harder, it might consume a bit more energy on a kind of an ongoing basis, an operational energy basis. But taken from a global perspective, it will mean we can actually build far fewer buildings and require far less buildings in terms of the kind of real estate area we need in the future. So I think it's about being smart with the way that we use our buildings is kind of a key. I think the other thing is also, to me, if you're reusing an existing building, it's like running the 100 meters, but you're already starting 60 meters down the track. There's an awful lot of stuff you haven't got to do. So if you can reuse the structure, or you can reuse the facades, and you can kind of change the business equation. So client entities can then spend money on other things, maybe better social infrastructure, better community spaces, higher quality finishes in the buildings to actually make them more pleasant and more enjoyable places to be. I mean, after all, we'd much rather spend the money on decent furniture than we would on some hidden structure. So I think that's one of the big advantages from a commercial point of view, is retaining the buildings in use can really be a kind of a good business thing.
Chris, thank you. And I think a lot of people will probably be quite pleasantly surprised by what you just said. I don't think we go to that many sessions like this where we hear people say, make buildings work harder. They might use a bit more energy, but that's better than having too many buildings. Makes total sense. Thank you. Another great soundbite. Phil, I want to come to you next to bring in your thoughts from a design perspective, but I know yourself and the team at Ramble have been doing a lot of work on measuring and monitoring circularity. So maybe if you can wrap up this question about design principles and move into your experience in how we measure and benchmark the circular economy, that would be great.
Absolutely. There are a myriad of different things we can do, and I'm conscious we haven't got the entirety of New York Circular City Week to talk about them, but we are working with quite a lot of retailers now who know that they have a relatively short lifespan for a new build. So by considering that lifespan and considering the way in which you design your construction details, we've designed schemes that are fully demountable, fully deconstructible, so all of those materials can be reused. And when we did an analysis of the life cycle carbon of all of that, there's a 56% saving. Yes, perhaps some of the savings were in the construction, some in the operation, but when you look at the whole thing together, just purely looking at the way in which you construct the building to make it demountable is massive savings, and they can reuse the entirety of that material later on. But that is from an entire new build and disassembly perspective. You add that on to adaptability. We work with many different clients that don't know exactly what they're going to need in the future, not quite sure what the tenant brief might be in 5, 10, 20 years' time. So considering, perhaps let's take it from an M&E and mechanical electrical perspective, where you place those services and perhaps the sizing of them is key. Perhaps you make that ductwork slightly larger, which will consume slightly more material for the starter, but when you want to extend that building in the future, You don't have to change the entirety of that circulation space in order to add either an extra floor or extend the building a little bit. And you make that entire facade perhaps demountable so that you don't waste any of that material that you've used. So there are many different ways that are bespoke to that particular brief. But as people have said so far, considering the second and third lifespan of the building, you need to have that within the brief. You need to bring about that right at the start of the design so that you can incorporate those features essentially for free. But answering your question on the measurement of it, now the principle of sort of circularity sometimes could be seen as quite qualitative rather than quantitative. So sometimes it's difficult to quantify, even though the recent circularity gap piece aligned with very much of what Adrian said at the start. The world is only 9% circular. How you measure that is an incredibly difficult way to do it. But in taking it back to the built environment, there are three key areas, I would say. The first of which, looking at waste, that can be quantified in volume and weight and diversion from landfill percentage targets. I know that in LEED and in BREEAM and in very many other certification systems, there are points and credits associated with diversion from landfill percentages. But what has really established itself in the last, well, relatively recent few years is life cycle carbon analysis, LCA. You're able to do that at product level. We're able to do that at building level. We're able to do it at portfolio and infrastructure level. So looking at different design options, quantifying the different carbons, we're becoming really adept at that now. And that really facilitates evidence-based design decision making, which is really key. I would also say that life cycle costing, LCCs, are evolving as well. The way in which costing exercises across the life cycle are conducted, most recently to incorporate residual value using some of those design elements I was saying earlier, that is going to, again, all those three things put together are going to really enable the design team, the client, the project team to make decisions based upon whole life cycle benefits rather than just independent stages.
Phil, thank you. And I think what you're speaking to there takes us onto a whole different topic of the business case for circular buildings versus others, but that needs to be a separate webinar. What I'd love to do just for the last couple of minutes, Rhiannon, you are geographically closest to New York. You spend a lot of time in the city, and perhaps you might have some insights on some of the specific barriers for New York as a city that is hosting this week. But is there anything you can share about barriers and solutions? What are your feelings that are the key barriers for implementing a circular economy in a city as diverse and energetic as New York? And where do you see that innovation would be needed?
Yeah, certainly. New York is, one of our, leadership cities here in the U.S. And I'm located in Washington, D.C. I'm where our home and headquarters is. And I would also like to, think that we're doing some amazing work here. But when we think about so many things and, what becomes the biggest challenge is money. Economic models today just do not reward the circular economy. So it's often more difficult and expensive to be circular. So if we, think about if a company wants to do good, oftentimes it costs more or they're penalized for making investments that reduce pollution or improve circularity. So it becomes, very much this balance. So when we think about it as an example, the cost to recover plastics is much higher than the cost of new plastics. So as a result, it can be hard for manufacturers to take on this problem. So when we think about it, it goes back to my opening comments around collaboration and the need. And I also want to comment kind of on the Spider-Man meme as well, because this is a connective web. And there are going to be, it requires just so many different stakeholders and so many different kind of leadership models and opportunities within all of this. So I think it's actually, I'll agree, comments before, it's impossible to avoid that. So when we think about the solution here, it really is to work together with industry and government partners to come up with solutions that are going to reward best practices and reflect that full economic and environmental costs from not recovering those materials. We must economically scale to achieve success here. Otherwise, that is just going to, we're going to push that rock up the hill every day and end up at the bottom again if we can't think about the economic scaling and opportunity.
Rhiannon, thank you. Those were great remarks. You've also spoken to Stuart's question that's come in of how can we avoid the Spider-Man meme where every stakeholder points to each other to enact change, and you've totally spoken to it on collaboration. Sonny, is there anything else you want to add to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is really the specifics of how. I mean, this is where the real work begins, right? It's in getting to know one another. And in New York, we're in such a fantastic place to do this because you have the headquarters of so many fantastic companies where you can actually go to folks' offices, you can have a chat with them, and you don't have to, like so many of us do, reach out over the internet sort of blindly and say, hey, would you like to have a virtual coffee? Or maybe I'll come visit you eventually and we can talk about this. You can actually sit down with people because there are so many wonderful people working on wonderful solutions in the same place. And that's really powerful. And I think there is just really no shortcut around doing that. That's just the work we all have to do. And I think everyone on this call is doing that in really fantastic ways. I would also say there are really awesome opportunities to continue to offer folks opportunities through the work that we're all doing in this space. So for example, if you have a building that you are removing, really leveraging what's in that building to go out and make those connections. And maybe folks say no the first time, no, I can't use that. No, I'm not interested in helping you repurpose that. But in the future, if you ask again, maybe that no will turn into a yes. And I think just continuing to put yourself out there and continuing to invest time in every project, saying, okay, what would it look like for us to invest the time to reuse 10% of this? What about 20%? And saying too, as you look down your supply chain, what would it look like to have a meeting with 10% of our suppliers on the next project? Let's try to do another 10%. And really leveraging that education, because while there are suppliers and companies that are also looking at this, just really honestly, just firing the ones that aren't doing it isn't going to cut it. We have to continue to invest in those relationships and leverage our integrated design practices to their best use, which is really continuing to bring each other along on this journey towards the circular economy.
Thank you, Sonny. I'm conscious that we're running out of time, but we have somehow talked for most of 40 minutes and we've somehow not talked about regulation yet, which is actually extremely impressive. But we have a question from Patty about European regulation. And I'm sure even in the States, there's a lot of interest at the moment in the incoming and updated technical criteria of the EU taxonomy, which was recently refreshed a couple of weeks ago. And Patty is asking about European standards for the circular economy on building materials, salvage and reuse, and how have these innovative regulations, policies like the European Green Deal, how have they moved the market, and what lessons learned could be applied to other economies and geographies? David, I'll come to you first, then on to you, Phil, if it's okay.
Yeah, so at European level, there is a massive European Union Circular Economy Action Plan. And as part of that, there is a whole piece of work that has been going on for the last 4 or 5 years on the circularity of building materials and the like. So there is a good amount of focus on it. There is a massive amount of R&D funding that also sits behind that. I think also, though, Katrina, just to note the point I made right at the start, I think there is a lot more that planning will move on in the future as well, which is less about when you're at the building material end of things. Of course, there is changes in waste regulation, which is more at end of life. And I think the other thing that I would always want to look at, without getting too far away from the question, is clients, and generally. I'm sure the same with many of the panel, Phil and Chris. The projects that you're working on, actually connecting it with clients is probably almost drives up a faster change than necessarily regulation. And clients may not necessarily talk a huge amount specifically about circularity, but they will talk about the need for flexible spaces. They will have set science-based targets, of which scope 3 and demolition and new build is a big area. So I think that's probably my plea is, yeah, absolutely, let's look at the regulation today. Let's look beyond that. And then also let's look for other drivers, not just regulation, which generally, in my experience, sometimes goes a bit slower than some of other things.
Totally agree. We don't have time to wait for regulatory change, do we, Phil?
Yeah, completely agree, and very much along with what David was saying. One thing I would perhaps take from a UK's perspective, in London, I said relatively recently, the planning authority has designated that all large projects shall have a circular economy statement. It doesn't put particular targets. It does give a framework about the content of what that statement has, but what they've also done as well is, I mentioned it earlier about a life cycle carbon assessment. They've also designated that you have to do an LCA at the same time. So that's step one. Step one is do the calculations, present that information, do the assessment. They're going to be sat on a wealth of information. Every single project presenting that information, they're going to have a database of valuable information that then I very much hope the next step is putting minimum targets and taking the next steps. As you said, David, yes, we have some leading light clients who want to go above and beyond regulation. They see that as something far in the back mirror. But to bring the entirety of the industry up at scale, unfortunately, I think the sticks are going to have to be louder than the carrots. So yes, regulation is going to have to take some of those lessons learned and take some quantifiable, robust data and put some minimum targets to take all of that upwards.
Thank you, Phil. Okay, I'd like to come to each of you, please, for one closing remark. And it's a very difficult question because I'm going to ask you to give our audience advice and your one takeaway, your one sentence for people listening today. What is the one thing you would like them to remember from this session? Chris, I'll come to you first, if I may. Chris, you're on mute.
Thanks, Katrina. Okay, so what would I say? I mean, because we've heard so much. Well, I think the first step is to garner knowledge around the basics and the social and environmental building impacts that can come out of circularity, and use the knowledge immediately to make a difference and to measure your process in some form of science-based way. So get into the game, change things as quickly as you can, and measure your outcomes so you can learn from them. Thank you.
David.
Well, I think we've covered a huge amount. All I'm just going to do is do a big shout out to the Circularity Accelerator that's launching on the 16th of May, because we're all closely involved in that. And that's such an exciting initiative that I'm really excited. So everybody, yeah, thank you for joining today. And let's get involved and do some great stuff together.
Took the words right out of my mouth.
Sorry, Catherine.
Phil, you're unmuted. Do you want to go next?
Absolutely. Am I still muted, or are we all good?
We can hear you. Fire away.
Excellent. All good. I'd like to finish with a note of positivity. We are doing so many things that are parts of the circularity piece. We're not starting from a blank sheet of paper. We are designing the buildings to be dismantled. We are doing low carbon construction. We're doing so many aspects, so many things across that circularity piece. We just need to tie it all together, and that will accelerate us to get to where we need to be.
Thank you. Rhiannon?
Yeah, so I am going to diverge a little bit with maybe a note of caution. I think that the circular economy has a lot of potential momentum, but there are a lot of people who are critical because they see it as potentially greenwashing or just, another neat trick. And this is something that I think is, absolutely essential to avoid. So, we've talked a lot about collaboration, but I also think it's really imperative that we do, and what we've done at WorldGBC. We have to think about whole systems. We have to think about holistic aspects of products, materials, buildings, and all of the stakeholders that go into that, because I think the avoidance of greenwashing and the support to that skepticism is absolutely critical to any level of success.
Totally agree. Thank you. Sonny, take us home.
Yeah, I would just second my thanks, the thanks that Sven shared for starting this program and leading the accelerator. Thank you to WorldGBC and to all my fellow panelists for being a part of this work. I think this is not a technical problem, as we've discussed. We know how this can be technically accomplished, but we need to be in relationship with each other in order to make it happen. And so I'm looking forward to that. And I'd invite everyone on the audience today to reach out to at least one of your suppliers, one of your colleagues in the industry, and continue this conversation, talk about things you can do in order to share resources and continue to move us from a supply chain to a supply circle, if you will.
Thank you very much. Okay, so final remarks from me. As you have heard, the Circularity Accelerator program of the World Green Building Council Network will be launching on May the 16th. Please keep an eye on social media and you'll find more information on the WorldGBC website very soon. And may I also take the opportunity to invite you all to participate in the celebrations in person and remotely for the World Green Building Council 20-year Leadership Summit, which will be taking place from the 27th of June to the 1st of July in London, in the United Kingdom. Again, more information on the WorldGBC website, and we hope to see many of you in person for a long overdue celebration and strategic conversations. And finally, it's a big thank you from myself and from Adrian to all of you for joining. Particularly a special thanks to our fantastic panelists today. I feel like we got way more than an hour's worth of expertise from all of you, but thank you so much to Phil, to Sonny, to David, Rhiannon, and to Chris for your fantastic contributions and your time today. And with that, we will close the session. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. And we look forward to hopefully working with you soon on tackling the circular economy in the built environment. Thank you very much.